I think it's pretty obvious that the job of White House press secretary for Donald Trump is nearly an impossible task. Now, when Sean Spicer resigned after his 6-month tenure, a lot of the heat was aimed at him. He had a very rocky tenure. He was constantly in fights with the press. He was made fun of on SNL by Melissa McCarthy. A lot of abuse sent his way. And I'm talking about this because he has a new book out, and I'm going to interview him Sunday on MediaBuzz. But things look different now because we've seen somebody else in the job, Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And many of the same charges that were hurled at Spicer now being hurled at Sanders. You're lying, you're not being straight with us, you're just repeating the spin, you don't correct the errors. And there have been some very testy briefings with the woman who used to be Spicer's deputy, and now that she has spent almost a year now in that top job. But so it's fascinating to look back at the Spicer tenure, and in his book, The Briefing, he is candid about certain things. First of all, he says, this really jumped out at me, I knew in my heart I was better suited to take on the role of communications director, but that the offer of actually being at the podium for the new president was too tempting to turn down. And at the time that he ended up leaving, you may remember that Anthony Scaramucci came in. He was going to essentially be Sean's boss. He was shaking things up before he imploded, and it was before he imploded that Spicer decided to step down. He says in the book, I had been defined. There was no potential for a do-over. Now, he's not a big fan of the mooch, as you might imagine. At one point, he says that having Scaramucci take on the job, because he wasn't a professional PR person, he was a businessman, was like asking a student pilot with one lesson to take the stick of an F-22 in mid-flight. Okay, interesting analogy. But he decided not to stay on even after Scaramucci left while Spicer was still there. And a lot of this goes back to his very first day on the job, a day when he was not even expecting to be on camera. It was January 20th, 2017, the day of the inauguration. And the president was watching television coverage and was really upset at all of the talk about the crowd size and how his crowd was so much smaller than Barack Obama's. So he sent Sean out to scold the press and to argue rather implausibly that he had a bigger crowd and all of that. And Spicer admits in this book, I should have lowered the temperature and not so broadly questioned the media's motives. I had made a bad first impression, he says, and looking back, that was the beginning of the end. So imagine, even in hindsight, saying your first day on the job officially was the beginning of the end. Now, he does criticize the president a little bit on the Twitter front, not for just tweeting at all, but for sometimes picking fights on Twitter, sometimes with journalists. Sometimes he's cutting up the opposition, says Sean, and sometimes he's cutting up his own best messages. But Spicer takes a lot of shots at the press, including individual journalists by name, and he has this theme, and I've interviewed him before, and he's talked about this before, where he says that people who ask these questions because the cameras are on, and he tried to turn them off on many occasions late in his tenure, that they're trying to stir up trouble, gin up outrage, be confrontational to become a cable news star. In a couple of cases, it's worked because you have people who are working for other organizations who got contributor contracts with places like CNN. At the same time, the cameras also help the press secretary because you can drive a message, you can call out the press, you've got the same advantages of being the lead on the evening news or the lead of many cable segments by the way you give it back. So, traditionally, the press secretary has had to navigate between a president who he or she works for and a press corps who expects that person to be accessible, to tell the truth, understanding that there's a lot of spin involved in the job. It's even harder when you have the President of the United States watching these briefings, which are all on TV now, never used to be the case, and critiquing your performance and letting you know when you have screwed up in his estimation. So I think maybe there's a little more sympathy looking back at what Spicer did. At the same time, he should be held accountable for his tenure. I'm glad that he has acknowledged some of these things in his book, but he also, believes that the media are fundamentally unfair to the president, and by extension, were often unfair to him. So stay tuned Sunday, MediaBuzz, for more of my conversation with Sean Spicer.